Well, let's go ahead and get started. Tonight we're going to continue looking at Jesus' ministry to the multitudes in Galilee. So let's go to the Lord in prayer. Lord, today we are so thankful for all the good things that you have given us. We're thankful for your blessings. We're thankful for your word that you have given unto us. I pray, Lord, that you will anoint your word as it goes out. Anoint my lips to speak those words that you would have me to say, and anoint our hearts to receive. And we thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we've been looking at the last couple of weeks at the opposition that Jesus has encountered, primarily from the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. And up until we started looking at the problems he was having with the Pharisees about his doing things on the Sabbath, they seemed to have been more wanting to understand more of what he was doing. Once he started talking about the Sabbath, suddenly things changed and they now become more accusing in nature. So tonight we're going to look at the incident of his disciples eating grain on the Sabbath. So let's go to Matthew chapter 12, verse 1 through 8. At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." But he said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the showbread which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Yet I say to you that in this place there is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Hello?
Mark puts it this way. He says, "Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath,
Are you calling?
and as they went to his disciples, began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, 'Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' But he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath.'" And Luke, he gives it a little different look. He says, "Now it happened on the second Sabbath after the first that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, 'Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?' But Jesus answering them said, 'Have you not even read this? What David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those with him, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat?' And he said to them, 'The Son of Man is also the Lord of the harvest.'" So here we have three different accounts of this incident. All of them actually are say basically the same thing, but we get different details from the different writers. Now, the first thing we run into is this idea of the second Sabbath after the first. Actually, in the Hebrew, it is called the second first Sabbath. The second first Sabbath. And so right away we wonder, what in the world are they talking about, the second first Sabbath? Well, Jesus, remember last week, Jesus was in Jerusalem, and he was there probably for the Sabbath. That's what he was there for, for the Passover. And while he was there, he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda. Well, you have to understand the Passover celebration. In Jerusalem, it lasted for 7 days. The first day of the Passover was a time when they, actually prior to the first day of the Sabbath, of the Passover, they made sure they had all the leaven out of their house. They had to get rid of all the leaven, anything that would bring any kind of leaven at all. It had to be completely cleaned. Then on the day of the Passover, that night, they would eat the Seder. And that was a special meal that they had to prepare without leaven. And it was, the Seder actually went through in an order. So they would eat, first of all, a sour a vegetable of some sort, like a horseradish. They would eat bitter, what they call bitter vegetables, which would be like romaine lettuce, or there was something else they would eat that was more bitter. And they had to dip it in a specially made sauce. These all had symbolic reasons, and they all went to the Exodus from Egypt. And so they go through this Seder. And actually, in those days, they sacrificed a lamb. They brought the lamb home. They took it to the priest who sacrificed it. Then they brought it home, and they had a lamb roast dinner, basically, is what it was. And so everything is laid out. You can go online today to the Orthodox, one of the Orthodox sites, and they have all the recipes. You can make your Seder, just the way you like. And they have different ideas for different kinds of vegetables to use. It's kind of interesting. I was looking through it today. But that would happen on the first night of the Passover. The next day was a time of celebration, of feasting, without having all of the order of how to do things. And that would go on for the next week. Now, in the original Jewish law, they were not allowed to work on the day of the Sabbath or on the last day of the Sabbath week. Those 2 days they were not allowed to work, and so they treated those as if they were Sabbaths. They were Sabbath, but they were, as far as working and doing anything, they had the same law applied to those. Somewhere within that 7-day period, the Sabbath would fall. And so that would be considered the first Sabbath. That was the Sabbath that fell during the Passover week. The reason they call it the first Sabbath is because 7 weeks later was the Feast of Weeks, or of Pentecost. The only way they could figure out what that was to count from the first Sabbath during the Passover week out. The 8th Sabbath, or the 7th week, would be the time for the Feast of Pentecost, which was the day after that 7th week. Okay? So when they said it was the second first Sabbath, what they were saying, this was the second Sabbath after the first Sabbath during the Passover week. They might say it's the third first Sabbath, or the fourth first Sabbath. Okay, does that kind of make sense? They're only talking in terms of that 7-week period that leads up to the Feast of Weeks, or of Pentecost. So Passover and Pentecost were two of the main feasts within the law, and so it was very important that they get these right. The reason why it becomes difficult is because, just like on our calendar, Saturday was the Sabbath day, or what we would call Saturday. Well, every year it falls on a different date. So even though the Sabbath always fell on the 15th of Nisan, 15th day of Nisan, month of Nisan, the Sabbath may have fallen on any one of those 7 days in there. So once they established the day of the Passover, which they did through lunar observation at the beginning of the month. So nobody knew for sure when it was going to start. They could figure it out, but most of them didn't know for sure until the high priest announced when the Passover date was going to be for that month. He would do it on the 1st of Nisan. So they had 15 days to get ready for the Passover, basically. Once that happened, then everything went from there. So they had to continually refigure what it was going to be because they were using a lunar calendar, which is different than what we use today. All right, so Jesus had been in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, and he came back to the, let me read more of this. I have a thing here, so let me just read this on the second day. I've explained it, but let me read this. I think it's kind of good. The second day of Passover was a great festival on which the wave sheaf was offered, Leviticus 23 and 11. From that day they reckoned 7 weeks, or 7 Sabbaths, to the day of Pentecost. The first Sabbath after that second day was called the second first, or the first from the second day of the feast. The second Sabbath was called the second, or the second Sabbath from the second day of the feast, and the third, and so forth. This day, therefore, on which the Savior went through the fields, was the first Sabbath that occurred after the second day of the feast. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That kind of breaks that up.
Confusing.
To understand this, it is proper to remark that the Passover was observed during the month Abib, or Nisan, answering to the latter part of March and the 1st of April. The feast was held 7 days, commencing on the 14th day of the month, according to Exodus 12, 1 to 28, and 23 and 15. On the second day of the Paschal week was the week of Passover. The law required that a sheaf of barley should be offered up as the first fruits of the harvest, Leviticus 23, 10 to 11. From this day was reckoned 7 weeks to the Feast of Pentecost, Leviticus 23, 15, and 16, called also the Feast of Weeks. Deuteronomy 16 and 10, and the Feast of Harvest in Exodus 23 and 16. The second day of the Feast of Passover, or of unleavened bread, was the beginning, therefore, from which they reckoned towards the Pentecost. The Sabbath in the week following would be the second Sabbath after this first one in the reckoning, and this was doubtless the time mentioned when Christ went through the fields. Should be further mentioned that in Judea the barley harvest commences about the beginning of May, and both that and the wheat harvest are over by the 20th. Barley is in full ear in the beginning of April. There is no improbability, therefore, that this narrative, on account of the season of the year, this feast was always held at Jerusalem. All right. Also, it's interesting to note that the disciples and Jesus were picking the barley, but they were doing it after the first fruits offering. If they had been picking barley or anything out of the fields prior to the offering of first fruits, they would have been in violation of the law. Because you could not eat anything out of your field until after the first fruits offering had been brought in. So, but this was following that. So they were okay. They passed that test, okay? All right, so Jesus and his disciples were hungry as they were walking through the fields, and so they began to pick the barley heads off and take them in their hands, rub them in their hands to get the chaff and the husks off of the grain. Probably blew on them, blow the husks off, and then they would eat the grain. Now, in the King James Version, it says they were picking corn. And a lot of people, you know, when I was a kid, you know, you had them out there picking ears of corn off of the corn stalks. Well, corn wasn't there. Corn is something that was found in the Americas and is actually a vegetable that was indigenous to to the Americas, not to over there. Europe, Mideast, nowhere had any ears of corn until the explorers who discovered America and so brought the seeds back and they planted it. So up until then, there was no corn. So this was barley, is actually what it was. So they were out there eating this grain, and some of the Pharisees questioned Jesus as to why he allowed his disciples to violate the law of the harvest. It's interesting to me to note that while Jesus, in the Mark account, it says that Jesus and the disciples were hungry and they were eating. So Jesus and the disciples were eating. And yet nowhere did the Jews accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath. He says, why are you allowing your disciples to do it? It was the idea, and this was and Jesus kind of uses this in his answer to them. You know, if you were a rabbi, if you were considered a senior rabbi, which Jesus was, because he was far more knowledgeable in the law than any of them. I mean, they couldn't ask him a question he couldn't answer. And so he was considered a senior rabbi. He could do things that the rest of them couldn't do. And they would basically turn their back because of his position. It's kind of like today. If you're a police officer and you're caught speeding, you know, you can show your badge, and generally they'll say, okay, go ahead, yeah, go have fun, you know, that's the end of that. It was that same kind of idea. And so they did not include Jesus in their accusations. Moses had commanded the Hebrews to abstain from all servile work on the Sabbath. Now, this is Exodus 20 and 10, 35, chapter 35, verses 2 and 3, Numbers 15, verses 32 to 36. On any other day, it would have been lawful for them to go through the barley field and pick off heads of barley and eat it. Anybody's barley field, according to Deuteronomy 23 and 25. If you were hungry, you found a barley field, you could walk out there and pick up some barley and eat it. You couldn't go, you know, with a big bag and reap it, but you could take enough barley to satisfy your hunger. And this was part of the law. It was the idea that you took care of people. So Jesus answered their accusation or their question with two examples of excused law breaking. The first was David, who ate the showbread from the tabernacle in 1 Samuel 21, 1-6. And this is what it says. Now David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid when he met David, and said to him, why are you alone and no one is with you? Now he wasn't alone in terms of not having any people with him. He obviously had his mighty men with him. But he wasn't in the company of the soldiers that you would expect David to come in, you know, with an army. So he was basically just there with a few men. So David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such a place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest and said to him, truly, women have not been from us, have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out. And the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect whole common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day. So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place on the day when it was taken away. So what the story tells us here is that David, who was fleeing from King Saul, comes to the city of Nob, to high priest Ahimelech, and tells a lie. Mm-hmm. So here right away we have the first thing, he lies. Well, that broke the law right there. But okay, David did it. And then after he lies about why he was there, he tells Ahimelech, well, we're hungry. And we're on this special business and we need 5 loaves of bread. And Ahimelech said, well, we don't have 5 loaves of bread here, but we do have the showbread. Now the showbread was put out at the beginning of the week, and it stayed in the holy place for a week, and then they brought it out and they put fresh bread, fresh hot bread in its place. And this was the showbread that sat on the altar in the holy place. And then David, he went in, and you read the other accounts, he went into the holy place and took the bread and brought it out and gave it to his men that were with him to eat. So he violated the law by lying, he violated the law by going into the holy place, and then he violated the law by eating bread that was consecrated and could only be eaten by the priests. And Jesus used that example, and the reason he did is because nobody condemned David for what he did. These Pharisees should have been up saying, we can't hold David as somebody of really a great character because he violated the law. He should have been put to death. They didn't do that because it was David, you see. The idea, if you held a high enough position, you could do what you wanted. The second example was the priests themselves, who worked in the temple on the Sabbath. Now, nowhere in the law did it say the priests are exempt from working on the Sabbath. And yet they worked on the Sabbath. They had to. You brought an animal to be killed or to be sacrificed, you had to bring it to the priest. And they had to prepare the animal, they had to kill the animal, they had to put it on the altar, sacrifice it, cook it. So they had the slaughterhouse, they had the cooks. These were all priests, basically that's what they were doing. They were killing animals, dressing them, skinning them, and all the things you do with an animal before you cook it. And then you had cooks out there, basically priests, who cooked it on the altar. And yet Jesus said, you don't condemn them. If it's okay for the priest to do that, and it was okay for David to do that, he says, there is one in your midst, if you only understood, that is greater than the temple. Not greater than the priests in the temple, but greater than the temple. The place where they worship. The whole idea of what they were doing. There was somebody greater than that. And that, of course, was himself. The temple was made as the house or residence of God. However, it was only temporary and could be destroyed by the actions of man. The temple, in fact it was, 70 years later, it was leveled and hasn't been built since. And this was the second, they call it the second temple, actually it was the third temple that was built. These temples had all been destroyed and wiped out. And here's Jesus sitting there, and they didn't realize he was greater than the temple. He was the living house of God, and while the flesh could be killed, he could not be destroyed. He was the temple. And when they put him to death later, what did he do? He rose again. So they could not destroy him. They could destroy the flesh, they could not destroy him, because he was the living temple. His flesh was the living house of God. Therefore, he could permit his disciples to forego the law for their own benefit. That's what he was telling them. And of course, they really enjoyed hearing that, as we see in here. Jesus refers to the command he had given them. I want you to notice this. Where is that? Down in verse 7 of Matthew 12. says, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. You remember, back over there, when he told them earlier to go and, where was this? To go and learn what Hosea 6:6 really meant. When he was eating with sinners, remember when he called Matthew? They were all in the house eating, and the Pharisee says, why are you eating with sinners and publicans and doing this? And he said, go and learn what this means. And he was referring to Hosea 6:6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So this was evidently some of the same guys. And he says to them, in other words, if you had have gone and learned what that means, you would have not have been accusing anybody who were guiltless. They didn't do what Jesus told them to do. Therefore, he reminded them, because you didn't do it, you're not able to understand what's going on. If they had gone and understood what that means, Jesus, or God, he is more interested and he desires mercy, and he does not desire sacrifice. That's his desire. Sacrifice is something we do because we have to do it. Mercy is what he really desires. And so what he was saying here is that if you had understood the law, really, he was laying it out really to them to figure out, but what he was saying to them, if you really understood the law was given as mercy from God. You know, the Apostle Paul, he said the law was given so that sin could be made utterly sin, from the NIV version. I like that term because what it showed was it allowed men to see how sin is and what is sin and highlight sin so they could avoid it. It was an act of mercy, not an act of judgment. Okay? We've turned it into an act of judgment, but God really didn't do that. He was giving them ground rules of how God wants to show mercy. In the eyes of God, meeting the essential needs of man is not a violation of the law, but a manifestation of mercy. And we're going to see that later as he brings in some more examples to bolster what he has said here. He goes on to say that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was intended for the welfare of man, designed to promote his happiness and not to produce misery by harsh, unfeeling requirements. It is not to be so interpreted as to produce suffering by making the necessary supply of wants unlawful. Man was not made for the Sabbath. Man was created first, and then the Sabbath was appointed for his happiness. Genesis 2:1-3. His necessities, his real comforts and wants, are not to bend to that which was made for him. The laws are to be interpreted favorably to his real wants and comforts. This authorizes work only of real necessity, not of imaginary wants or amusements or common business and worldly employments. This is according to Barnes. I really thought that was well written there. The real reason for the Sabbath was to allow men to rest and rejuvenate from a week of hard work. It was not meant in some way to please God. but rather to provide time for men to be with their families and rest. You know, what the Jews thought was that God wanted everybody to rest in some way. This would please God. In some way, God was saying, you know, I want you to stop this, get over here and don't do anything. Well, that really wasn't what God was saying. He's saying, I am setting aside this day as a time for you to rest, rejuvenate, have family time. We would call it family time today. This was a time when you met with your family, you had family events, you stayed pretty much home and rested, but you know, you had your family there and you were doing things, and they would play games and they would do things at home. We get the impression the Sabbath was a time, you know, when they kind of sat around and rocked back and forth and hummed and read the scriptures or something, but no, they never do that. It was a time of relaxation and fun. And that's what the Sabbath even is today. If you talk to Orthodox Jews, that's a time when they really kind of let their hair down, is on the Sabbath, but they do it at home. They don't go do anything other than that. That's what they do. And that's what God intended for it to be. But the Pharisees, of course, and the Jewish leaders had turned this into something that was a weight, a burden on them. Jesus then goes on to do this. In verse 8 from Matthew, he says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. He finished, all three record his statement there, that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. And we look at that, he's the master of the Sabbath. Well, to us, you know, we might say, okay, he's the Lord of Sunday, you know, or Saturday or something. But to the Jew, this statement meant that he was announcing that he is the Lord who gave the law. Therefore, he, as master of the law, could violate it or change it as he saw fit. He wasn't just saying that, you know, hey, I can do this because I'm a rabbi. He said he was the Lord or master of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given by God. Therefore, he had to have been putting himself on equal footing with God. He was saying, I am the God of the Sabbath. That's pretty, you know? And of course, we see the reaction of these guys later. But this is what was so infuriating to them. By identifying himself as the giver of the Sabbath, he associates himself with the Sabbath, which was given for the good of man. Just as the Sabbath was not given to condemn man, so Jesus did not come to condemn, but to provide for the necessities of man. It's a kind of an obscure thing, but when you really think about it, what was he saying? He tells them first the Sabbath was not given, man was not to be for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man, for the good of man, for the welfare. Then he says, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, I'm the God that created the Sabbath. He's saying the Sabbath was given, and the Son of Man, being the Lord of the Sabbath, was given for the good of men, not as condemnation. Wow. That's quite a statement. It's quite a statement. All right, so that was the encounter on the Sabbath when he was plucking grains. Now we come to another Sabbath. This was a week later probably. Matthew 12, verse 9 to 14. Now when he had departed from there, that was where he was walking through the grain field on the Sabbath, he went into their synagogue, and behold, there was a man who had a withered hand, and they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? That they might accuse him. Then he said to them, What man is there among you who has one sheep, and if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored as whole as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and plotted against him how they might destroy him. Okay. All right, Mark chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. So they watched him closely, whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? But they kept silent. And when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved by the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the others. Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him how they might destroy him. Luke chapter 6, verses 6 to 11. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man who had the withered hand, arise and stand here. And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy? And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Okay, so here we have another Sabbath, possibly the next Sabbath, the next week. He goes into the synagogue, as was his custom. Now this time was a little bit different, because when he went into the synagogue, the Pharisees started watching him with the intent of seeing if they could in some way accuse him of violating the Sabbath. He came in there to teach. That's what he did. And I've often wondered, if the Pharisees hadn't have been there, would he have called the man with the withered hand forward? Because the man with the withered hand did not come to him. He did not, like the other events, that we've seen healings, where they came to him and asked to be healed. This man was sitting back standing back in the crowd, and did not, in any way that we know of, approach Jesus. But when Jesus understood that the Pharisees were there for the express purpose of watching him to see if they could accuse him of healing on the Sabbath, what did he do? He called the man forward. In other words, okay, yeah, you want to see if I'll heal on the Sabbath? Let me show you what I'll do. And he called the man forward. The Pharisees had stopped asking Jesus for the sake of knowledge and started accusing based on their knowledge. You see, that is the thing that we see a lot of today, is that people say, I have it all down, I understand everything, and so then they begin accusing anybody else that doesn't see it just the way they do. Instead of asking questions to see if perhaps they have the wrong account or they have the wrong view, they would rather use that as a way of accusing somebody. That's why we have such strong divisions within the denominations within Christianity. It's crazy. Because one group sees one particular thing one way and another group sees it another, well then they start accusing each other by asking questions. Well, if that's so, what about this scripture? What about that one? That is so silly. It is so silly. Because nobody knows everything that's in this book. And we will never understand everything that's in this book until we get there. And this book is very elastic. It's very flexible. And what one group sees in this book applies to them, and they can take that and do something with it. Another group may look at that very same thing and say it's completely irrelevant, or have an entirely different view of it. But it fits what they're doing. Okay? And so we need to understand that we should ask questions, not with the idea of accusation, but to try to understand, to look at something through a different view, a different window, and see what they're looking at it. And who knows, we might find something we've never seen before. And that's what makes the Bible so exciting to me. I do this, I hear somebody will say something, I said, that's crazy, I've never heard that before. And then I go, why don't I go look at that? I'm going to look that one up. And so I'll start studying it. I'll start looking at it. And I'll say, wow, I think he's got something there. And I'll start interpreting it. And I say, well, I see. If you look at it from this point of view, that's what you see. At least I understand where they're coming from. I may not agree with them, but I understand it. And that's the important part, that we understand. And that we don't spend time accusing and trying to catch somebody in something. But that's what they were doing. So in answer to the Pharisees' question, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath, Jesus requires with a proverbial question. What he said was, what Pharisee would not rescue, and I'm paraphrasing, what Pharisee would not rescue his sheep on the Sabbath if it falls into a pit? Are you going to let the sheep lay in the pit and die? It's your one sheep. You're just going to walk away and let the sheep die? He then asked, how much more valuable is a man than a sheep? The obvious answer to the first question was, yeah, we're going to pull him out of the pit. Well then, how much more valuable is a man? Would you let a man fall in the pit and walk away from him? We know from the parable that Jesus uses later of the Pharisee who saw the man who was wounded on the road. He pulled his skirts up and went around so he wouldn't touch him. Yeah, they would in fact leave a man die on the Sabbath. Now the law permitted the rescue of animals on the Sabbath. So Jesus justified healing on the Sabbath by calling to mind the spirit and not just the letter of the law. If the law allows you to go out and rescue an animal on the Sabbath, how much more should it allow you to go rescue a human being? Jesus then answered in Matthew the question with a direct answer. Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. That's pretty straightforward. So the sequence of events here may be just a little muddled because it's hard to know between Matthew and Mark and Luke where these fit in because they don't all say it just exactly the same. So I just kind of put it how it kind of made sense to me. Jesus then called the man out of the crowd and he had him stand in front of the Pharisees. Now Jesus could have just said, well, there's someone here with a withered hand. Stretch out your hand in the crowd there and you'll be healed. He wanted to make a spectacle of the healing. And so he called the man out and had him stand in front, right in front of the Pharisees. Here he is standing here. He didn't hide it. He didn't try to evade it. In fact, what he was saying in effect was, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath. Now watch me do good. He brought the man up, and he said, and this was a way of accentuating his answer, but Jesus then asked the Pharisees, is it lawful to do good or evil, to save a life, or to kill on the Sabbath? Now, according to Jewish tradition, they had a maxim that they used, And basically, what it said was, it was considered an evil act to not do good when the chance arose. If you had the opportunity to do good and you don't do it, it's evil. Same thing goes for this. If you had an ability and a chance to save a life and did not do so, it was the same as killing the person. This was their tradition. And so he says, okay, is it lawful to do good and not evil on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to save them a life and not let them die on the Sabbath? That's what he's asking. That's a pretty tough question to answer, isn't it? And then, according to Mark, Jesus looked at them, each one of them. It says they looked around. That means he looked at each one of them. And in anger, when they did not reply, because of the hardness of their hearts. Now, this anger was not the kind of anger that you have a hatred for somebody, or it's not that kind of an anger. It's an anger that is based upon grief. It's based upon, he saw that these guys should have known. They should have been able to properly interpret the law. And because they were not properly interpreting the law, it was a sin, and it was the sin that made him angry. We wonder sometimes if we should get angry about things. Yeah, we should. We should be very angry about a lot of things that goes on. We should be angry that our country has slipped into the place of accepting homosexuality as just a normal lifestyle. And now the transvestites are now just a normal part of life. That's just normal. I mean, drugs, that's normal. Everybody should be doing that. You see, we should be angry at that, not at the people. And that's where we get in trouble, because we get angry at the president, we get angry at Congress, we get angry at our state leaders. And boy, some people are just, blow his brains out. We should be angry at the sin. We can't do anything about the leadership as people, because God's putting them there. But we can be angry about sin. And we can get angry enough to take the problem to God. Okay, but that's what Jesus was doing here. He was angry, because it went on to say that he was grieved. It came out of a grieving heart. They accepted the tradition, but only as it pertained to the first 6 days of the week. If you saw somebody on Monday that was doing good and you didn't do good, well, then it was evil. But when it came to the Sabbath, you can't do anything, because that would be considered work. All right. Jesus commanded the man to stretch out his hand, and it was completely healed. Now, since Jesus did not touch the man, he didn't do anything. And if they had tried to bring him to trial or accuse him before the Sanhedrin or Pilate of working, he would have said, I did nothing but stand there. That is legal on the law. Under the law, I can say whatever I want. Under the law, I can converse, I can talk, I can preach. I can do all these things under the law. I can't work. Now, if I had reached out and touched him, you might have a basis for saying I did something. But because he merely told the man, stretch out your hand, you see, he thwarted their efforts. They couldn't prove he did anything. He didn't touch him. He didn't march him around. He didn't lay hands and shake him. Said, stretch out your hand. So technically, he did no work on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees couldn't accuse him of doing anything. Now what the Pharisees did here next is extremely interesting. According to Mark, the Pharisees went out and they formed an alliance with the Herodians, who were their bitter enemies. The Pharisees and the Herodians were bitter enemies. The Sadducees and the Herodians were kind of on the same page. They had views that were very similar. But it was the Pharisees who were the keepers of the Orthodox law and of the whole idea of the nation. It was the Pharisees. Now these weren't terrible guys, by the way. And really, we get the impression they were a bunch of terrible. They really weren't. They were very devout men, and their whole idea, their whole life was wrapped up in keeping Israel under the law, separate and acceptable to God. That was their whole plan. As individuals, some of them didn't follow that, but that was their basic thing. Now the Herodians, they were followers of Herod. That's where they get the name, Herodians. And they believed that the Jews should pay taxes to Rome. They should allow Rome to appoint a leader over them and to accept the religion of Rome. And the reason being, they had been defeated by Rome, so therefore Rome was should be considered to be the qualified or the rulers over that region. They had won that right by defeating Judah. So therefore, they were the legitimate rulers of the land. You should follow them, accept their religion, or parts of it anyway, and just shut up and do what they say, basically. That was the Herodians, followed Herod. The Pharisees, on the other hand, opposed paying taxes. They said, nobody, we should not be paying any taxes to anybody except in the temple and to God. We should not be, of course, accepting any religion other than pure Judaism. We should not allow anyone to rule over us except our own king that God appoints. This was their whole thing. But notice what they did. They had such a hatred for Jesus that they were willing to overcome their hatred of the Herodians and actually form an alliance with them and say, how can we destroy Jesus? Now the Herodians wanted him destroyed, not on religious grounds, but because he was preaching something that would lead to an insurrection against Rome. And they were afraid that if Jesus had followers and it really took off, everybody would rebel against Rome. And it's kind of interesting that at the inquest before Pilate, it was this were some of the things that came up. Not only did he say he was king of the Jews, that was against, because Herod was the king of the Jews, He said he was king of the Jews, and you start looking at all the accusations. He had the idea of he is God, he's king of the Jews, he wants to lead an insurrection against Rome. These were the things that were brought before Pilate. These came from the Herodians. So in the end, this alliance worked very well as far as getting Jesus crucified. Now the Pharisees were focused on accusing Jesus of not keeping the Sabbath because under the law it was a capital offense punishable by death. Exodus 35:2 and Numbers 15:32-36. So the reason they were so anxious to catch him, avoiding or doing something against the law was because they could ask that he be put to death. That's what they were after. If the enemies of Jesus could prove that he broke the law of the Sabbath, they could call for his death. So this was a pretty, this wasn't a matter of just, well, he violated the law, but he in fact violated one of the strictest laws within Judaism. Now at the bottom here, I've just included a little table, and we're basically done tonight, by the way. I wanted to get these two in, and we'll be starting a different portion of this next week. So here is kind of what happened, just kind of a synopsis. He healed a man, should be man, by the way. He healed a man on the Sabbath day and told him to take up his pallet and walk. And Jesus' response to their accusation was, God has not stopped the work of sustaining creation and continues unto the present, even on the Sabbath. That was his point. He was accused of permitting his disciples to pull the heads of grain from the stalks, to rub out the kernels, blow off the chaff, and eat the grains. And then his response was, David ate showbread when he was hungry, which was in violation of the same law. The priests work on the Sabbath, sacrificing animals, and the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And finally, he healed a man who came to synagogue with a withered hand on the Sabbath. It is lawful for a man to save a sheep who had fallen into a pit on the Sabbath. How much more is it lawful to save a man? And then, is it lawful to do good or evil on the Sabbath? And that's it for tonight. I got it done. Really short. Do we have any questions?
If the Pharisees were the devout, right, they were the devout Jews to
Yes.
keep the law, make sure
Yes.
that was keep. What was the Sadducees?
What's that?
What was the Sadducees?
The Sadducees were a different group. Now they believed in the law, but not as strict as the Pharisees. The Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection, which the Pharisees did. The Sadducees thought, much like the Herodians, they should pay tax, and they should accept a foreign ruler over them, because they had been conquered. They should be able to accept that, and that also the law. They had a much more liberal view of the law. They were much more open to accepting paganism ideas and inserting them into the law, into the worship services. So that was kind of the difference in the two. The Sadducees were really the Democrats today, and the Pharisees were the Republicans. I mean, if we wanted to put it into today's, from a political standpoint, that would be what we would call them.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, you're out early tonight, so we'll come back next week and we start